my eyes, sir. I've never used them before.
You guys remember back in 2015 the dance opera film Symmetry, written and directed by filmmaker Ruben Van Leer, was filmed inside Cern, which is the largest experimental particle physics facility in the world. Van Leer, with support from a team of theoretical physicists and their sister organization Arts at Cern. Van Leer uses Symmetry to explore the intersection between art and science and what he believes will help us expand a new dimension to better understand the relationship between human beings and nature. So Symmetry tells the story of a physicist named Lucas who works at Cern and has encountered a myriad of difficulties finding the primordial particle that unlocks the mystery of the universe. After being summoned by what Van Leer calls the god of art, Lucas becomes enlightened and as a consequence realizes himself as part of the universe, and now driven by this great cosmic love, leads a team of scientists to discover the true meaning of humanity's relationship to the cosmos. That's the official summary, the official description provided by the director himself. Now, there are a couple ways to interpret this. There is the official description, the story the director gives you, and yet there is a completely different way to analyze this story, the one I think fits best, and it's going to completely melt your brain when you see it. So check this out. Let me break it down for you. Of course, Lucas is a name of Greek origin meaning bringer of light or bright one. In Latin, it means light. But who is this god of art depicted in this film? Well, there are many contenders. The solar deities like Apollo or Hyperion. Apollo is the god of art, music and poetry, of prophecy and knowledge. He represents reason and intellect and physical superiority. Apollo also means destroyer, as in Apollyon or Abaddon, the angel of the bottomless pit found in Revelation chapter 9, verse 11. Or with Shiva the destroyer in the Hindu cosmology, who in endless cycles of creation and destruction destroys everything in the cosmos to make way for a brand new one. And there's Lucifer, who's considered the light bearer, the bright one, the morning star, who was the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, and whose tabrets and pipes were prepared for him specifically by God himself. In classical Gnosticism, which is the heretical attempt to reinterpret and rewrite biblical cosmology, and the Platonian and Hermetic Cabalistic philosophies from which it came, known as the mystery schools, and from which many mystical occult systems emerged, the idea of this god of art takes on a completely different form. And if you're not familiar with Gnostic cosmology, I'm going to walk you through it real quick. So here we go. The supreme being in Gnostic cosmology is known as the invisible spirit, the monad, or the one, and is described as this unknowable conscious entity comprised of pure intellect, pure mind consciousness that exists in a silent void outside of space and time. His thoughts emanate from his being and take form as entities known as aeons. From the aeons, thoughts continue to expand and multiply, which populate the realm of the Gnostic heaven known as the entirety or the pleroma, and is considered the region of light. The very first thought that emanated from the invisible spirit's mind occurred when it stared into the primordial waters before creation, saw his own luminous reflection, and fell in love, insinuating an intimate encounter with himself that begat the hermaphroditic aeon known as Barbelo. Barbelo is portrayed as the first power, the thrice male, thrice named androgynous one, the supreme female principle. Barbelo multiplies the thoughts of the invisible spirit and is the one who embodies his divine gnosis or knowledge. In Kabbalah, Barbelo is the Ein Sofar, or the solar absolute, the limitless light of the spiritual sun. Barbelo comes from the Aramaic words bar, which means sun as in male offspring, and Baal, which means sun as in solar, making Barbelo transliterated as the son of the sun. Barbelo begat the self-originate, or the cosmic Christ, or the Gnostic Christ, of which Barbelo is considered his mother-father. This is the Gnostic Trinity, or the Gnostic Godhead. The cosmic Christ begat the Aeon Sophia, or wisdom. Sophia's thought brought forth an evil, corrupt, lion-headed serpentine entity known as Ealdabaoth, or as Plato called him, the Demiurge. In Sophia's shame, she cast Ealdabaoth out of the entirety so none of the other aeons would see her error. Ealdabaoth, existing alone in the celestial realm outside of the Gnostic heaven, believed that he was the only being that ever existed, and out of his ignorance, vanity, and malevolence, created the material world from his corrupt thoughts, imprisoning mankind within it. Sophia's error is considered the Gnostic fall, which created a divide, a veil between the world above and the realm below. Darkness and chaos came into being beneath the veil and became physical matter. In Gnostic cosmology, physical matter is a bad thing. The goal of the Gnostic then is to understand this cosmic opera and obtain its related gnosis or self-knowledge. Salvation for the Gnostic is realizing their divinity and reconnecting with the real cosmos, not the illusory one of the Demiurge. This is known by Crowleyans, Theosophists, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Luciferians, Satanists, and various other occult and New Age movements as the Great Work. The Gnostic cosmology is all mind and mind consciousness, the underpinnings of the atheist, humanist, and transhumanist movements. But even with all of this, which built itself from the biblical account of creation, there are still only two realms: the realm of the invisible spirit above and the material universe below, with the bridge between the two being esoteric occult knowledge. In a collaborative paper highly celebrated by Cern physicists and its extended global community, titled Symmetry, Collision of Arts and Sciences for a New Dimension, Ruben Van Leer, along with colleagues Tony Yu Zhao and Fritjof Capra. The paper details the creative process of making the film along with its associated mystical and philosophical ideas. As I mentioned earlier, the message being communicated here is to marry together what they're calling art and science. But for what purpose? I thought Cern was engaged in real material science. Who are these people and what role does art play in this process? Tony Zhao is an interesting character. He's trained as a biomedical scientist. He's the founder and CEO of two organizations, Inspiree's Education Group and the Creative Arts in Education and Therapy. Tony is a certified movement analyst. Dance movement therapy is a technique thought to integrate the mind, body, and emotions of an individual, and of which a trained practitioner is considered a body language expert. And movement is the unspoken primordial human language that, when implemented in a therapeutic environment, can liberate the individual from a myriad of psychological dilemmas. Dance movement therapy comes from the modern dance movement that emerged during the counterculture era of the 1920s and 1930s, with renewed popularity during the 1960s version of the counterculture. Modern dance has deep links to communism and radical politics, with subversive agencies like the Works Progress Administration and the Workers' Dance League, which was an offshoot of the Soviet-inspired Workers' Cultural Federation. The Workers' Cultural Federation in 1931 declared, quote, "Art is a weapon," end quote. And a few short months later, the New Dance Group, an organization of communist activists dedicated to social change through dance, was premiered in New York City, and later became officially part of the Workers' Dance League with the new slogan, quote, "The dance is a weapon," end quote. In a journal article titled "Performing Communism in the American Dance, Culture, Politics, and the New Dance Group," she explains, quote, The new dance group program notes explained, the working class is growing in number, growing in strength, and growing in knowledge. It is simultaneously developing itself and its weapons. One of its most important weapons is our modern revolutionary dance. The new dance group and Workers' Dance League dancers brought communist propaganda tools to U.S. government culture projects. The U.S. government administrators welcomed, learned from, and imitated the politically expedient Soviet-inspired lessons. End quote. Tony sits on the board of Ecopoiesis, an international organization whose mission is to, quote, promote eco-human knowledge and technologies and integrate the creative arts, ecology, and human sciences, end quote. In other words, it's a strategy that they believe will reframe human thinking to globalist philosophy, which they call ecological education, along with the arts as worldview shaping tools for what they call a quote-unquote post-secular sustainable society. Post-secular describes a world where religion becomes a social and political structure. In other words, it's the New World religion and the New World order. I wonder if the dance presented at this function was considered a modern revolutionary weapon too. This is the satanic ritual performed at the opening celebration of the Gotthard Tunnel that was held for a gathering of dignitaries and ruling elite in Switzerland, not too far away from the location of Cern. Fritjof Capra, co-author of the Symmetry paper, sits on the council of the Earth Charter. It goes without saying what the Earth Charter is all about. He's also the founding director of the Center of Ecoliteracy in Berkeley, California, which is a think tank whose mission is dedicated to advancing education for sustainable living. He's a former theoretical physicist, a systems theorist, a chaos theorist, and a deep ecologist. He's written several books, one titled The Tao of Physics, in which he discusses the deep parallels between esoteric Taoism and physics. Taoism is a philosophy that teaches that by living in harmony with nature, meditating, and detaching the self from the mind, one can extend their lifespan, and after countless reincarnations into new bodies can eventually become immortal as pure consciousness. It's the notion that the cosmos, or the Tao, is a conscious, creative, self-organizing force underlying all of reality. The goal of the Taoist is to let go of the self and become quote-unquote one with the universe. In a documentary about his book, Capra explains the effect the early data from the Hadron Collider had on him. While taking psychedelics, they caused him to become aware of the cosmic dance of the universe represented by Shiva. This spawned the dramatic change in his worldview that prompted him to write the book and plot a new trajectory for his scientific and philosophical pursuits.
At the very beginning of my encounter of Eastern traditions, I was very threatened myself, for maybe different reasons, but I felt it threatening to leave rational thinking, the analytical mind, the kind of world that I have grown up in and that I have been educated in, and to try and transcend this world in meditative experience. That is something threatening to somebody who does it for the first time. I was sitting by the ocean one late summer afternoon, watching the waves rolling in and feeling the rhythm of my breathing, when I suddenly became aware of my whole environment as being engaged in a gigantic cosmic dance.
Capra's ideas were rejected by many of his colleagues because, well, it's mysticism, not science. Capra believes this mystical approach, if applied to physics and basically everything else in the world, provides, quote, lessons for our global survival, end quote. Capra found the theories of mystic and physicist Niels Bohr to be foundational in his thesis. It was Niels Bohr, along with another Manhattan Project scientist, Isidore Rabi, that collaborated on the establishment of Cern, which they first presented the idea at a UNESCO conference in June 1950 to, quote, increase international scientific collaboration, end quote. Niels Bohr's theories are rooted in occult mysticism, and he even incorporated the yin and yang symbol, a concept central to the esoteric scientism of theosophy, as well as the symbol that represents technocracy, into his own coat of arms. In an interview with a philosophy professor at Rutgers, Capra was asked, "Is it true that the Buddha would just be a physicist?" Capra replies, "Let us talk about a first-rate Einstein or any of the great physicists. Now, such a person has already a high degree of intuition, and this intuition will be sharpened through the mystical training. And then once he went through this mystical training and became enlightened, he would be sublime in his intuition. He would also, by some miracle, not have forgotten his mathematics. He will be able to get back and resume where he left off and do the physics," end quote. Do you think Bohr felt himself one with the universe? Definitely, definitely. There is evidence? Oh yes, definitely. So you're saying Bohr was a mystic? Yes. Oh yes. And the film Symmetry encapsulates the esoteric occult mysticism and worldview behind the Cern project. The story begins with Lucas, who is getting increasingly bewildered and frustrated that his particles won't collide. He takes numerous trips back and forth from the collider, which is portrayed as this colossal, masterful creation divinely carved from man's hands. And after several trips back and forth, he still gets collision failed. He looks over his charts and graphs, which look more like sigils for chaos magic instead of collision patterns, and still he can't figure this out. It's not until a colleague accidentally causes coffee to spill on a chart of binary code, and through the chaos event of the spilled coffee, a pattern emerges on the pages symbolizing symmetry. An invisible entity summons him back to the collider again, and he receives a vision of a descent into what looks like the underworld through a beacon of light that takes him to a vast wasteland where he awakens inside a circle. This god of art is there. Then suddenly he finds himself back at his workstation, overcome by this experience as if he's going in and out like Neo of the Matrix. He returns to his charts and graphs, sees the coffee-stained notes, sees the symmetry, the pattern in the chaos, and begins to enter in random zeros and ones, which bring the collider to life. The face of the god of art appears on all the screens, calling him back to the collider. This seems to initially anger his colleagues, who are rejecting what's happening right now, and a chase ensues that leads them all to a platform that stands directly in front of the collider like some sort of altar where they all begin the cosmic dance with Lucas at the center. The cosmic dance opens the gateway to the abyss. They all descend, descending and ever descending, and now they are in some sort of primordial state in between worlds. It's creatio ex nihilo as they all become pure consciousness and merge with the cosmos. Lucas, however, becomes the enlightened one, seeing through the all-seeing eye, signifying the left-hand path. He is returned to the wasteland, only this time in priestly robes. He has crossed the abyss. He has achieved gnosis. He dances the cosmic dance with the god of art of his own free will now, and she weeps at this divine accomplishment. Lucas has achieved gnosis. He's now enlightened. He's done the great work. Okay, I get it. But see if this analysis doesn't fit a little better. The wasteland depicted here, to me, resembles the Klapotic realm of Hermetic Kabbalah. Now stay with me here, this is getting a little deep. The Sephirot is the tree of life representing the 10 emanations through which the infinite reveals itself while perpetually creating both the physical realm and the higher metaphysical realm. Below, like a dark mirror, Klapot is the infernal region, the dark side or inverse of the Sephirot. If the Sephirot is the tree of life, Klapot is the tree of death. In Luciferianism, embracing the concept of Klapot is a psychological exercise for strengthening their belief system of becoming a living god. The Klapotic demons are fallen angels who know that light is wisdom and darkness is malignant and repugnant, so the practicing Luciferian desires to gain mastery of both realms. Of course, these realms are considered states of mind that exist within the self of the magician as they are atheistic in their worldview. This concept of the Klapotic realm is not from the Orthodox Jewish mysticism of the Kabbalah, as it originates with Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who cultivated this concept in his writings around the year 1900. In Aleister Crowley's Thelema, which was universally claimed to become the New World religion, in his book Magic in Theory and Practice, Crowley writes, quote, "There is a single main definition of the object of all magical ritual. It is the uniting of the microcosm with the macrocosm. The supreme and complete ritual is therefore the invocation of the holy guardian angel, or, in the language of mysticism, union with God. All other magical rituals are particular cases of this general principle." End quote. For Crowley, the single most important goal of the adept is to connect with one's holy guardian angel, a process he called, quote-unquote, knowledge and conversation. Keep in mind that Crowley's use of the term God does not mean the God we know from the Bible or any supernatural supreme being. For Crowley, God is the holy guardian angel, and the holy guardian angel represents one's truest divine nature. All of the entities in Crowley's pantheon are archetypes for the adept's unconscious. They are all aspects of the individual magician. The holy guardian angel for Crowley was I Was, whom he considered was his higher inner self, from which he wrote the Book of the Law. In his book, Magic Without Tears, he writes, quote, "It should never be forgotten for a single moment that the central and essential work of the magician is the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Once he has achieved this, he must, of course, be left entirely in the hands of that angel, who can be invariably and inevitably relied upon to lead him to the further great step, crossing of the abyss and the attainment of the grade of Master of the Temple." End quote. In his book, Liber Samek, he writes, quote, "The angel is in truth the logos or articulate expression of the whole being of the adept, so that as he increases in the perfect understanding of his name, he approaches the solution of the ultimate problem, who he himself truly is. The angel is the spiritual son of the soul of the adept. The angel is the true self of his subconscious self, the hidden life of his physical life." End quote. Thelema being an atheistic libertine transhumanist movement, every interpretation of Crowley's work and that of his contemporaries was to be completely demystified. It's not supernatural, it's not metaphysics, it's pseudoscience and psychology, with the elements of both designed to reframe the mind and the will of the magician seeking his own divinity. In his book Confessions, written in 1929, Crowley wrote, quote, "Thelema implies not merely a new religion, but a new cosmology, a new philosophy, a new ethics. It coordinates the disconnected discoveries of science, from physics to psychology, into a coherent and consistent system." End quote. Crowley seems to struggle to make magic and science compatible, as did Blavatsky with Theosophy and her quote-unquote science of the soul idea. While Crowley seeks a synthesis between science and magic, magic takes the higher order. It is science that has to be brought into the magical system, not the other way around. And it's my opinion that in that regard, in the realm of mystic-oriented physicists, nothing really has changed. The crossing of the abyss is the annihilation of the ego. While Crowley's definition of who the angel is has changed over the years of his writing, he wrote in the Equinox, Volume 1, that Theosophists call the angel the higher self, the silent watcher, or the great master. The Golden Dawn calls him the genius. Gnostics call him the logos. The Bhagavad Gita calls him Vishnu. He's also the Tao. He is the subconscious. But toward the end of his life, he interpreted the angel as an objective being completely apart from any of us. In his book Magic Without Tears, the angel was not the higher self, but an actual being that existed. This disembodied being could be an angel or a demon, according to Crowley. What's interesting in trying to make sense of the madness of Crowley's mystical system is that there exists a dweller in the abyss, believed to be the last great obstacle between the adept and enlightenment, and whose function is to destroy the ego. Crowley wrote in Confessions, quote, "The name of the dweller in the abyss is Coranzon, but he is not really an individual. The abyss is empty of being. It is filled with all possible forms, equally inane, each therefore evil in the only true sense of the word, that is, meaningless but malignant insofar as it craves to become real." End quote. It almost sounds like he's describing superposition prior to wave function collapse. Coranzon is the sole inhabitant of the chasm human magicians must cross to attain ultimate knowledge or gnosis. Those capable of abandoning their ego will be able to move beyond the abyss and achieve the title of Master of the Temple. The dweller in the abyss is not unlike the abyss he inhabits. He is a void, the zero, with no true form of his own. He is empty of being. He can take on the appearance of any form of his choice. He is synonymous with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. He is Satan, and is said to have communicated to Crowley that he is envious of God's newest creation, man. In Cabalistic gematria, a system that assigns numerical values to Hebrew words, Coranzon bears the value 333. This number is exactly half of the number of the beast, 666, as described in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, and gives Coranzon significance as an aspect of Satan. Though he is typically explained as embodying the female aspect, Coranzon is still a male entity as part of the beast. And I've talked about this before. I've shed light on artists that create ritual quote-unquote art from this very dark and sinister realm. Artists like Michael Boremans, celebrated by this elite corporation, who creates paintings, sculptures, and even film from live models in his studio that depict some of the most ghastly, inhumane images, including dismemberment. And Matthew Barney, creator of the disturbing film The Cremaster Cycle, this extensive art installation that includes a 5-part feature-length film and a series of related sculptures that is highly celebrated in elite circles like Guggenheim. In his film The Order, he presents an extremely perverse and disjointed display of schizophrenic absurdities that are supposed to represent, among other things, the initiate's ascension in Freemasonry to the highest degree. Okay, so Barney's work is all about this dark Luciferian transition from the masculine to the feminine that I've talked about in this video, and was crudely drawn on the wall of this Balenciaga photo. This crude pictogram shows the house on fire, diabolically similar to the one depicted in I Pet Goat 2. The initiate down here in the dunce cap, representing the destruction of the traditional family and the initiate's ascension process. Shown here as the masculine transformed into the feminine, and completing at the top with the Baphomet, the final stage of human divinity, encapsulating perfect union of opposites, of polarities. From Guggenheim, quote, Matthew Barney's epic Cremaster Cycle is a self-enclosed aesthetic system consisting of 5 feature-length films that explore processes of creation. Cremaster 1 represents the most quote-unquote ascended or undifferentiated state, Cremaster 5 the most descended or differentiated. In Barney's metaphoric universe, these moments represent a condition of pure potentiality, end quote. And again, it's not just about transformation, it's about superposition. It's about being everything all at once, and then in the end, being transformed into this final state. And Louise Bourgeois, famous for the Arch of Hysteria sculpture and paintings, who chooses human suffering of this kind. You know, you see themes of dismemberment all over the place here within this realm. But she chooses this kind of human suffering as the staple subject of her work. And is another highly regarded artist in elite art circles who publicly proclaims her work is a device, not just for exploration into the macabre, but it's used for ritual, it's used for sorcery, for spellcasting, and she talks about this openly in interviews. In an article titled Women's Work Representing the Hysterical Body in the Late Works of Louise Bourgeois, the artist explains her Freudian-esque Marxist use of hysteria as an instrument of third-wave feminism. Quote, the feminism of the 1970s was very largely responsible for the reappearance of hysteria in the academies. The women's liberation movement of the late 1960s had protested against the prevalent stigmatization of women as hysterical by accepting and then overturning its implications. In other words, flipping the script. The hysteric in her many guises, as a witch or as Dora, was a proto-feminist heroine protesting against patriarchal oppression. End quote. In an article titled The Damned, the Possessed, and the Beloved, about art, architecture, and witchcraft, concerning her art installation that celebrates witches from 400 years ago that were given over to witch trials, and of which the hysteria, which she seems to now equate with some script-flipped rebellious definition for ecstasy, when used as a feminist symbol, or a feminist weapon, if you will, as an act of rebellion, hysteria becomes ecstasy. Is that making sense? She explains, quote, I am also a witch, end quote. Joel Peter Witkin, whose work uses human corpses. and who has inspired filmmaker Ari Aster for his work on both Midsommar and Hereditary. Two films that depict ritual-oriented death cults, the latter showcasing the bloodline bents of these demoniac covens. The woman responsible for the creative direction of Doja Cat's Paint the Town Red, Nina McNeely, an outspoken witch who publicly proclaims that she uses her performance art as ritual. Influenced by artists like Abramovic, and another outspoken dark Luciferian witch, Michelle Lamy, not sure how to say her last name, and who follows precisely this modus operandi of using performance art and design, haute couture, as sorcery to communicate very specific ideas that's targeted straight for one's psyche. They see this as liberation, that these are liberating instruments. It isn't, it's just witchcraft, it's dark masonry, it's psychopathy, quite frankly. And Alex Grey, famous for his DMT-inspired psychedelic art, used for the band Tool, their Vicarious music video, and other projects. The members of Tool are quote-unquote congregants of a very influential arm of this cult, which is a Crowley-esque, Thelema-style evolution of Enochian, Black Sun, dark Masonic, nihilistic Satanism, which I've talked about in several videos. They use psychedelics, among other substances, as a sacrament, as well as their art, and in this case, complex musical compositions and performances, visuals at their concerts that incorporate sacred geometry and metaphysics as this seductive, trance-inducing medium designed to assist themselves and adept members of their audiences to expand their consciousness, to reach enlightenment, and to realize their human divinity. Danny Carey, the drummer for Tool, whose father was a master mason, writes drum compositions using esoteric geometric math designed, in his own words, to summon demons and garner for himself good familiars, along with other gifts from, the underworld. In a 2001 Pulse magazine interview, Carey describes Tool's recording studio setup as follows. Quote, a huge geometric grid covers the ceiling, which is also decorated with gargoyles and skulls. 2 100-year-old swords, used by Carey's father in Masonic rites, adorn a wall with more geometric patterns. A mace, an occult library with umpteen first edition Aleister Crowley books, an enormous quote-unquote Enochian magic board, inscribed with the names of various angels and used to channel spirits, is lodged behind Carey's drums, end quote. In an interview from the same year with Modern Drummer, which sheds light on the choosing of the band's name, explaining the process for channeling demons, he describes in the interview, quote, every number has its strike on the subconscious in one way or another. The more you can make yourself sensitive to these things, the more it can open you up to other forces that may want to be heard. It's my job to get my ego out of the way enough to be sensitive to these things and let them flow through me. It's about tracing the manifestation of matter into the physical world. When people come to see us, I want to make it as much of a ritualistic experience as possible. Some beats suck people in, end quote. Alex Grey, with his wife Allison, were inspired to create what they call their quote-unquote church. They call it the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, a gallery of sorts that showcases a collection of paintings, each housed in its own special frame. Their mission, as proclaimed from their website, quote, is to build a sanctuary of visionary art to uplift the global community. The Chapel of Sacred Mirrors is a place of contemplation for community, honoring the practice of art as a spiritual path. This temple of sorts lends worship to the human as divine and his esoteric psychedelic journey. They hold ceremonies for their members held in their great hall named Entheon on nights of the full moon to, quote, honor the importance of cosmic alignment, end quote. These ceremonies offer short presentations from wisdom teachers, poets, musicians, etc. His wife Allison shares some poetry, and then Alex gives what he calls a sermon on the creative path. The performance ceremony adjourns, as the website explains, so guests can break for ecstatic music, dancing, and socializing, which ends in a closing ceremony, quote, in harmony with creatures in our world and a group howl at the moon, end quote. Sounds tantalizing. This man is a disturbing character who seems to have a strange obsession with the macabre, with death, like the artists I've already described. Even as a young boy, he collected dead animals that he buried in the backyard of his childhood home. Who does that sound like? At the age of 12, his science project was about LSD and the ideas of Timothy Leary. Now remember, Timothy Leary believed that it was his role on this earth to carry on Crowley's work. Crowley was his mentor. During Alex's college years, he shaved half of his head. He shaved the hair off of half of his head to reflect what he saw in a dream, where he opened a trash can lid, saw himself staring up from inside this trash can, and read this as some cosmic sign, some great cosmic sign to shave half of his hair off so he could focus on polarities in his work, those Gnostic polarities. From 1975 to 1980, Alex worked in the anatomy department of Harvard Medical School, where he prepared cadavers for medical students. He also talks about his involvement in various departments at Harvard that included psychedelic and paranormal studies. It was all of these elements, he claimed, that inspired him to create Sacred Mirrors, which invites the viewer to, quote, reflect on their own divine nature, end quote. This is all found on their website, by the way. However, some members have disclosed that the workshops Alex and Allison offer have felt more like hypnotism than guided introspection for creative purposes. In a workshop from 2019, an anonymous member describes feeling, quote-unquote, deeply uncomfortable during one of their so-called guided meditations, where they led a group of over 50 people to the lower realms. They played repetitive drum music while the members had their eyes closed while laying down. They described that it felt more like hypnosis than meditation, which put them all in a deeply vulnerable state. They were guided through a dark tunnel down through Earth where they were encouraged to see beings. This particular anonymous member reported seeing a bull-headed being with a male body dancing around a fire with snakes and bloody handprints on the wall. Afterward, the members were encouraged to create artwork depicting what they saw. After the artwork was finished, this anonymous member showed it to Alex and was shocked when he immediately identified the name of the being he had drawn as Morax, a demon who is known as the quote-unquote president of hell. Morax, or Marax, is the 21st fallen angel mentioned in the Lesser Keys of Solomon. According to Crowley and Mathers, he is the demon that governs astrology and the liberal arts, the liberal sciences. This member reports that they immediately recognized that this whole thing was very wrong, very satanic, cult-like behavior, and then discarded their artwork. They literally just threw it in the trash can. This artwork that they created from this exercise, threw it away, got rid of it. In 1976, in a letter to the editor of art magazine Wet, Alex takes credit for being the first man to violate a corpse in the name of quote-unquote art, and where he describes having access to a morgue, which resulted in his piece called Necrophilia. The piece, he explains, came to him after having a dream that he was violating a seductive and beautiful living woman who rapidly aged and died as they were making love, which he describes as terrifying, but also as the ultimate resolution of polarities, life and death. He explains that after doing the morgue pieces, he was less afraid of death, but more afraid of the moral and karmic consequences of his actions. He also reported that he was heavy into LSD at the time, and during one trip, the soul of the woman he violated came to him, extremely angry and screaming at him, asking, didn't he know he was violating her, that she was a person? He closes his letter saying that from that experience, he has come to regard the body as a sacred thing as well as a piece of meat. Lovely. What a lovely, lovely man. Alex and Allison Gray feel largely responsible for what they call the second psychedelic revolution and have curated art installations for Burning Man. Here he is pictured wearing the pendant he created for his cult that shows their secret language that they made up after one of their psychedelic quote-unquote journeys, as he calls them. If you watched my recent video on the AI God, I explained that this is the underpinning, this is really the religion of, the big tech Silicon Valley, neo-hippie, new age Satanists, basically, whose most eminent among them are part of this very same, burner-style psychedelic satanic cult. This is their religion. It's very anti-human, very anti-God, very big on Lucifer. Although many people believe that CERN's main mission is to create massive black holes or to open portals to other dimensions and open the gates of hell, releasing legions of chained and bound demons from the pit to bring about Armageddon, there really isn't much evidence to support any of these claims. Their mission is to find the missing particles that complete their mathematical theories, to unlock the mystery of how our material universe came into being, and then string it all together in one cohesive equation called the theory of everything. What their goal really boils down to is going beyond the standard model of physics and, well, to hopefully prove that God never existed. After they convince the world that God isn't real, not necessarily they being the physicists themselves, but their funding sources for sure, they will use this so-called data to assume control over nature and everyone's thinking and all living DNA in all sorts of dystopian and diabolical ways. Then the prophesied globalist world leader we know as the Antichrist will rise to the fullness of his power, and even though he is human, he will be worshipped like a god and perform great signs and wonders, deceiving the entire world, and so on and so forth. This is the goal. That's it. It's really that simple. It's a mind game. It's psychological warfare. The big pivot in all of this physics madness really began with one significant experimental finding: the wave function collapse that occurs when observation is included in the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment consists of the firing of electrons or photons, which are particles of matter, in an enclosed device through a panel with two openings. Instead of finding two strips of particles on the back screen, they found interference patterns, revealing that particles can act as both particles of matter and waves of potential. In an attempt to understand what happens during this process, they installed a camera to observe what exactly takes place. After the instrument for observation was part of the experiment, the waves of potential became particles. In other words, the simple process of observing and subsequently measuring, as every observation is also the act of measuring, turned waves into particles, potential into matter. They conclude somehow consciousness plays a role in this process. The event that causes wave function collapse is conscious observation and measuring. Does human consciousness play a role in the material universe? Some would like you to think so.
The photon is now only in one place. The act of our observing the particle has somehow changed.
Theoretical physicist Erwin Schrödinger theorized that waves, which are superpositioned before becoming particles, there is this notion of a chooser that, after observation, the particle shows up somewhere in the material world. Everyone's heard of Schrödinger's cat. The wave before being observed holds the information for every possible material outcome. Some physicists, particularly of the globalist variety, theorize that every possibility, every variable is housed in its own reality, its own universe. In other words, all those other possibilities don't decay into oblivion once a choice has been made. They travel somehow from this reality to a newly formed one outside of this reality, and since it's outside of our reality, we have no way of observing or measuring. All the experimental evidence shows that the waves simply decay. Theoretical physicist John Wheeler, friend and colleague of Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, and the man who coined the term black hole, said that reality is made up of information that is created by observation. For Wheeler, the observation must be made by something conscious. He asked the question, does the universe exist if we're not looking? In an interview with Discover magazine, quote, as Wheeler voices his thoughts, he laces his fingers behind his large head, leans back onto a sofa, and gazes at the ceiling or perhaps far beyond it. On an end table, near the sofa, rests a large oval rock with one half polished black so that its surface resembles the yin-yang symbol. That rock is about 200 million years old, says Wheeler. One revolution of our galaxy, end quote. Nobel Prize winner Frank Wilczek, looking to narrow the definition of this conscious observer, has said, quote, quantum theory is contentious and obscure and will remain that way until someone constructs within the formalism of quantum mechanics an observer, a model entity whose states correspond to a recognizable caricature of conscious awareness, end quote. What model entity could be capable of observing the universe in its entirety for all of time, past, present, and future? What conscious observer can be both omnipresent and omniscient, or even omnipotent to make all the necessary choices for reality to exist and keep existing? For men like Wilczek and the others, there can be only two possibilities. Human consciousness interacts with the universe, or the cosmos is its own conscious living being. Never at any time have they considered the most obvious choice, God. Wilczek is an activist and a major player in the World Economic Forum. He has long abandoned God for atheism, but claimed in 2013 that he's now more pantheistic in his worldview. He's well connected to the globalist elite and a staunch UN supporter. Incidentally, Wilczek was awarded the Templeton Prize for Progress toward research or discoveries about spiritual realities. It's quite a name for a prize, The Templeton Prize is an annual award granted to those whose, quote, exemplary achievements advance Sir John Templeton's philanthropic vision, harnessing the power of the sciences to explore the deepest questions of the universe and humankind's place and purpose in it, end quote. The prize was established, funded, and administered by Templeton himself starting in 1972. Sir John Templeton was a billionaire, a globalist, big banker, fund manager, philanthropist, and one of the biggest promoters of the New Age and the interfaith one world religion movement. Templeton's worldview is clearly expressed in his numerous books. He's an evolutionist, pantheist, and steeped in New Age theosophical occultism, whose goal, expressed in his own biography, quote, has been nothing less than to change mindsets about the concept of divinity, end quote. His views are deeply rooted in the New Thought movement and the Unity Church, which is metaphysical humanism of which its members believe they can manifest their own reality with the power of their thoughts. Followers of the New Thought movement believe that, quote, true human selfhood is divine, that comes from one's connection with a universal energy force, end quote. With strong emphasis on wealth and prosperity, this force can be manipulated at will by thoughts and feelings to determine one's own destiny. If you haven't figured it out yet, yeah, that's witchcraft. In his book, The Humble Approach, published in 1981 by his own publishing company, he writes that the Bible was written by men who were, quote, limited by cosmologies long since discredited, end quote, and whose writings were ignorant and primitive. Quote, no one should say that God can be reached by only one path. I am hoping to develop a body of knowledge about God that doesn't rely on ancient revelations or scripture, end quote. Oh, and this little gem, quote, in humility, we should admit that other universes may exist unknown to us, and not only in 3 dimensions, but maybe in 4, 5, or 6 dimensions, end quote. Michio Kaku is the big multiverse guy. As co-founder of string theory, or M theory, the many worlds interpretation is his baby. The theory, absurd as it is, has largely been dismissed in the physics community, and yet Kaku doubles down on the notion. He contributes a lot to the World Economic Forum, where he is an active member. Working from the absurd premise that the universe is a wave function that exists in many states, in his view, the Big Bang could have created a multitude of infinite universes simultaneously and continues to do so. In his book Parallel Worlds, he postulates that, quote, there is no need to invoke a cosmic observer that can observe the entire universe all at once, end quote. Kaku invokes a lot of science fiction in his book, including Edwin Abbott's Flatland, written in 1884, which posed the idea that in a four-dimensional world, higher planes of existence might hover right above ours and we wouldn't be able to see it. And H.G. Wells' book, published in 1923, titled Men Like Gods. He imagines several English motorists who inadvertently drive through an invisible barrier crossing into a parallel world. The alternate world's inhabitants, whom the travelers call utopians, had superhuman powers. Kaku writes, quote, because a hyperbeing would possess superhuman powers, usually ascribed to a ghost or a spirit. In another science fiction story, H.G. Wells pondered the question of whether supernatural beings might inhabit higher dimensions, end quote. He continues, quote, in this line of reasoning, the universe does have a point, to produce sentient creatures like us who can observe it so that it exists. According to this perspective, the very existence of the universe depends on its ability to create intelligent creatures who can observe it and hence collapse its wave function. Of all the theories proposed in the past century, the only candidate that can potentially, quote-unquote, read the mind of God, as Einstein put it, is M-theory, end quote. Kaku wins the prize of most strenuous mental gymnastics to work around the notion of God. Quote, for me, the real meaning in life is that we create our own meaning. It is our destiny to carve out our own future rather than have it handed down from some higher authority, end quote. The many worlds theory began with American physicist Hugh Everett, who echoed the idea that wave function never collapses and all possible events are equally real, and that countless copies of every person and everything exists in every possible configuration spread over an infinity of universes. After much deserved scorn from the physics community, he left the field and began a career at the Pentagon, where he worked in a team calculating potential deaths in the event of nuclear war.
You're offering a lecture on von Neumann-Wegner?
You would prefer?
The Everett interpretation.
Everett. Whose interpretation states that there is no change to the superposition of the humble quantum particle. Rather, there is a change to the entire universe.
It states that the macroscopic superposition exists.
And just so we're all clear what that means, it means the universe is constantly splitting, like the trunk and branches and twigs of an infinitely large tree. And on that tree, all possible worlds will exist.
It's supported by the math, and it's supported by the experiment.
But it's not supported by the real world.
The concept of the fourth dimension was a popular idea in the late 19th century among spiritualists and mediums. It was thought to be the realm of the paranormal, the ether where spirits dwell. Anyone could access it with special training. Johann Zollner was a German physicist who had prepared rigorous controlled experiments to evaluate the powers of the paranormal of magician and medium Henry Slade. Slade was known mainly as a slate-writing medium, where he would hold seances and claimed spirits would write messages on the chalkboard, but he was exposed as a fraud. But Zollner fell for it hook, line, and sinker, and even published a treatise titled Transcendental Physics, in which he claims Slade was able to perform these magical feats by accessing the fourth dimension. In Zollner's view, and based on his readings of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the fourth dimension was real, and unless you are properly trained or had a natural gift, you would not be able to see it. The Theosophical Society and the Society for Psychical Research celebrated this thesis and began to promote the concept of the fourth dimension as a spiritual realm in their writings. Ghosts and spirits are thought to dwell in the hyperspace of the fourth dimension. H.G. Wells thought the occupants of the fourth dimension had superhuman powers. Committed theosophist and hermeticist Claude Bragdon was an influential author and architect steeped in occultism and wrote several treatises and books for the Theosophical Society. He is known for his illustrations which illumined many occult and theosophical concepts such as sacred geometry and Platonic solids, and a fictional character he called Sinbad, borrowed from Arabian Nights, that has had many strange adventures in strange lands. In his book, The Frozen Fountain, he experimented with complex geometric shapes he calls projective ornaments that project light and shadows. For Bragdon, the fourth dimension is a realm just outside of our field of perception. Quote, for knowledge arises from consciousness, and consciousness everywhere and always is conditioned by the vehicle of perception, end quote. Bragdon, who was an evolutionist, in his book A Primer of Higher Space, The Fourth Dimension, he asserts that as humans, which are mere higher animals, through evolution, our senses exponentially evolve and increase. Quote, if the shifting psychophysical threshold is simply the dividing line between lower and higher spaces, then the whole evolutionary process consists in this conquest, dimension by dimension, of successive space worlds. Everything transcendental exists in some space, and therefore it is possible that by the intention of consciousness, one can first apprehend and then perceive as real that which is now considered transcendental. End quote. Using Plato's cave allegory as his example, by dwelling on elementary higher space concepts, one can break on through to the fourth dimension. In other words, if you can wrap your head around it with mystical training, you can see it and then get yourself there. It's evolution. The mind becomes the portal, the gateway to other dimensions. In The Frozen Fountain, Bragdon explains his concept of axonometric projection, a method central to Bragdon's architectural approach. He describes axonometric projection as a method of representation which, quote, truly renders the mental image, the thing seen by the mind's eye, end quote. According to Bragdon, the fourth dimension is a world that is mathematically true, but impossible to visualize, other than through linear diagrams, through orthographic projection. Orthographic projection is used to project a 3D object down to 2D, commonly used by architects and engineers for blueprints and schematics. Bragdon also designed theosophical temples and other architecture based on these ideas. On the subject of orthographic projection and finding other dimensions, back in 2018, a group of researchers from quantum gravity research were looking for the extra dimension too, or so it seemed at first glance. Using findings from experiments at Cern, they're working toward their version of a theory of everything, which they extrapolate in a presentation they published a few years back titled, What is Reality?
I want to tell you about the universe. What it is, how it came to be, what its building blocks are.
There are problems, however, gaping holes in their theories, and major jumps to some very strange conclusions. As they explain in their video, to understand reality, you have to first understand the dimension in which we currently reside. In this demonstration, the team starts with a 3D periodic quote-unquote crystal. This crystal is called periodic because its atoms are arranged in a crystalline pattern. It's a real material object. Using Claude Bragdon's orthographic projection, they take the 3D crystal and project from it a 2D image, so you can see how this process works. But the projected 2D image is not periodic. This 2D image is a quasi-crystal. Remember this. Quasi means seemingly, apparently, but not really. It's a shadow, a projection. It's non-material. Of course, they're just glossing over that, and they certainly do not disclose that this comes from Claude Bragdon. That would be mysticism, you see, not science. But let's move forward. From findings at Cern, they claim that specific patterns emerge from particle collisions, as the particles and forces reconverge back into one another, a process called gauge symmetry transformation, according to Clee Irwin, the theoretical physicist at Quantum Gravity Research, who, according to his website, is on a personal mission to raise consciousness on the planet through scientific breakthroughs that lead to solutions for advancing humanity. Clee has also founded a company called Irwin Naturals, with the goal to become the world's largest chain of clinics for special K and other psychedelics-assisted quote-unquote therapies. These fundamental particles and forces, as they reconverge, correspond to a very specific 8-dimensional shape that they call the E8 lattice. Using Bragdon's orthographic projection, they take a single cell of the E8 lattice and project from it a 4D quasi-crystal. Then they take the 4D quasi-crystal and orthographically project that down to 3D, which creates an 8D geometric shape with 240 vertices, called the Gnostic polytope. Then they take that shape and orthographically project another 4D quasi-crystal. When they measure the difference, they get the golden ratio. But that's a lot of quasi-crystals, a lot of immaterial imagery.
A group of physicists in Los Angeles is working on a new physics theory for a particular 8D crystal Yep, that's right. An 8-dimensional crystal is projected to 4D at a very particular angle, which forms a 4D quasi-crystal. And from this 4D quasi-crystal, they derive a 3D quasi-crystal, which they believe is the fundamental substructure of all of reality.
Of course, they don't tell you that in order to get to the E8 lattice in the first place, they have to insert quite a few hypothetical particles that haven't been discovered yet in several place markers. Is it just me, or does Clee Irwin's E8 lattice look strangely similar to Claude Bragdon's painting from 1931 called Crystal in Arabesque? But when it comes to explaining these findings, which seem to be quite a reach anyway, Clee takes it to an utterly absurd conclusion. Take a listen.
A universal collective consciousness is one answer, but that sounds New Age and religious. Now, nowadays, a good number of physicists discuss the idea that our whole universe is actually a code-based simulation in some fantastically powerful quantum computer in another universe. But it turns out that a universal collective-like consciousness of some sort may be physically inevitable.
Then he goes on with Kurzweil and Diamandi's Techno-Collectivism nonsense, which I talk about in greater detail in this video. They're outspoken communists. They're globalist technocrats. And pardon my saying, they are also categorically insane. I cannot emphasize this enough. These men are barking mad.
I remember when I was in junior high school, this was at the height of the sort of Red Scare, and communism was this very big bogeyman. And our social studies teacher wrote the goals of communism on the board, and it was from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. And he said, well, what's so bad about that? And we're all whispering to each other, is he coming? And, but we couldn't actually come up with a good answer as to what was wrong with that. What was wrong with it was the system used to go achieve that goal or try to go towards it, which was forced collectivism. A different kind of collectivism, I think, will get us there, which is the collectivism of freedom and self-organizing people who can contribute to the growth of knowledge.
Watch this video and you'll get the whole picture. And guys like Irwin and the Google heads and Muskie Bro are disciples of these loons. They're just parroting Kurzweil and Diamandis in these big conferences and major fundraising efforts like it's brilliance from their own mind. It's not. And these guys aren't quite as smart as they seem. They're great salesmen. That's pretty much it. I mean, my IQ is 2 points higher than Musk's, and I'm here to report that I'm basically retarded.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm kind of retarded.
They can sell, and many are falling for the shtick. Here's what they want. They want their AI god, and they want their simulated utopia, their digital heaven. Salvation for these people is eternal life as a computer upload into a simulated world of their own making. And it can work as a control device as well. They're talking about it. They're working on it. Yuval Noah Harari has spoken about it publicly. The way to call the masses, his useless people. And while in all of these promotional videos it appears that Clee's crew is working on the theory of everything, they're ultimately working on the simulation. Listen to this. Check this out.
A major amount of my future money will be spent on theoretically and experimentally developing a certain thesis that I have on topological quantum computing. And my thesis is on the hardware, not the software. We are seeing shocking advances in both deterministic and non-deterministic deep learning neural net architecture. For example, just months ago, Google's AI passed a famous test to determine whether a computer is conscious or not. It's called the Turing test. And these computer minds are now creating art, writing books, and even authoring publishable, novel scientific papers. So they can learn shocking things, like it's a weird algorithm. So the general aim of deep learning theory is about representations. So put differently, we have a network of representations in a given complex system. It is the superpower of advanced forms of strong AI to creatively simplify and model these topological spaces of combinatoric complexity. Elon Musk feels that with artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon. You know, demon as in Terminator or The Matrix. It doesn't matter, really. And so that's the singularity. That's the premise that really got me interested in quantum gravity. When I read Ray Kurzweil's book, then I went to that meeting at NASA's Ames Center, and it just put a cascade of thoughts in motion that led me to thinking about weird, deep things.
I can't confirm that it's connected, but Alex Garland's recent TV series, DEVS, seems to echo this same idea. Let me show you what I see, and I'm going to reveal so many spoilers here, just to be warned if you haven't seen it yet. DEVS is a sci-fi single-season TV series written and directed by Alex Garland, who was the creator of the film Ex Machina. DEVS depicts a Silicon Valley-style big tech company located in San Francisco, working not only on quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and a myriad of other tech projects, but its real intent, which is kept in secret, is a department called DEVS. The project is founded upon Forrest, the head developer's thesis that the universe is deterministic, that everything that happens is fixed upon tramlines. Listen as he explains.
The universe is deterministic. It's godless and neutral, and defined only by physical laws. An effect is always the result of a prior cause.
2 other films ran along this deterministic fixed tramline idea. Donnie Darko, which asserts the many worlds philosophy, and of course, The Matrix.
You see, there is only one constant. One universal that is the only real truth. Causality. Action, reaction, cause, and effect.
Everything begins with choice.
No, wrong. Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those who don't.
So on Forrest's thesis, the team has cracked the encryption code that allows them to not only map all the data of everything from the past up to the present moment, but it also makes extremely accurate predictions into the future, but only up to a certain point. Their super quantum computer, which is housed inside a facility that looks very much like the biblical tabernacle in the wilderness on the outside, and a Kaaba-esque cube of Saturn on the inside, can simulate reality down to the quantum level, as well as it can extrapolate outward to the macro, to the farthest reaches of the cosmos, with such accuracy that one would not be able to tell the difference between the simulation and actual reality. In an early scene, on a test run, they were able to render backward 2,000 years to the crucifixion of Christ, even cracking the audio, capturing Jesus' final words as he hung strangely from the cross, hands not impaled, but rather just bound by straps at the elbows. Of course, at this point in the story, these renderings are full of static and noise, revealing that something in the coding is still missing, for which they continue to tirelessly work to resolve this issue. The story leads you to believe that DEVS is about creating this predictive technology, but really they are working toward something else, something much more sinister, which you don't find out until near the end. On the grounds of the large complex is a colossal statue of Forrest's daughter, Amaya, in the same aesthetic as statues of Hindu gods. The meaning of the name Amaya, interestingly enough, is Mother City, or the capital, or Heavenly Valley. The valley it seems to encompass is more the uncanny valley than anything that could be described as heavenly. In Japanese, the name means the end. Forrest's primary motivation for the development of his technology is rooted in his grieving of the death of Amaya, who he feels was his fault. Garland presents the story as Forrest being this mad scientist type with a messiah complex, working from an old faulty thesis. Forrest is all about determinism and cause and effect, and won't be moved from this position. But his technology only finds success when the many worlds interpretation is added to the code. Very clever on Garland's part, creating a false dichotomy between 2 problematic unproven theories. Both determinism and many worlds are false, but Garland seems to lead you to believe that the latter is indeed the truth, and that it's supported by the math, by experimental findings. And it's not.
You're offering a lecture on von Neumann-Wegner?
You would prefer?
The Everett interpretation.
Everett.
It's supported by the math, and it's supported by the experiment.
But it's not supported by the real world.
When Forrest comes to realize that free will does exist and sees that reality is not fixed upon tramlines, and subsequently the many worlds interpretation is encoded in their system, they can complete their project. They can finish it. It works now. What you don't realize until near the end of the story is that they're making a simulated reality where people can be quote-unquote resurrected to live inside. In a pivotal scene in episode 4, Forrest shares his epiphany. Take a listen.
Everything we do is predicated on the idea that we live in a physical universe, not a magical universe.
Are you doubting that?
Not the physical universe, but I am scared we might be magicians.
A simulation, in spite of its endless number of variables, can only function in a deterministic fashion. Every possible outcome is already mapped and predetermined, so it's really just a roll of the dice within limited parameters. There can be no free will in the simulation. Any sense of choice is illusory. Inside a counterfeit synthetic world is the only place where determinism will work, and many worlds is just another form of determinism. And this is the hallmark, the very nature of a counterfeit. It looks real, but behind the curtain, it's just lights and clockwork. Non-determinism, otherwise known as free will, is realized in this notion of a chooser. But it's also revealed in Scripture. The Bible from cover to cover contains countless examples of people making terrible choices that go against God's design. Check this out. I saw this years ago while reading the mechanical translation of the book of Genesis. God's creation is designed as a binary system, and our scripture translations use moral terms like good and evil. But it's actually a system of function and dysfunction. Let me explain. The ancient Hebrew of the book of Genesis literally reads like program language. For each day of creation, God makes a separation. He divides the heavens from the earth, light from darkness, and so on. And at the end of each quote-unquote day, God makes an assessment and finds it good. But the Hebrew word here is tav, and while our translations say it means good, everyone assumes that this is in a moral sense, but it's not. It's in a functional sense. So far, everything God has accomplished was functional, in other words, in good working order. Come to day 7, God creates man, breathes conscious life into him, sets him in the midst of this garden where there exists many trees producing food. But also an additional tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? No, it's the tree of the discernment of function and dysfunction. Of which God told Adam not to eat of it on that day or he would die. In other words, not yet, it's too soon. If you notice, God does not deem Adam tav or good or functional like he has with everything else he had made. That alone speaks volumes. On to Genesis 2:18. God deems it not functional for Adam to exist alone. So he divides again, puts Adam in a quote-unquote trance, takes a piece of bone from his ribs, and from it makes the woman, Eve. Did God call it functional? Did he call it tav? No, he called them naked. Perhaps they're just hardware at this point, or as Isaac Asimov in I, Robot, they're equipped with just the basic 3 laws operating system.
There is a robot in this formation that does not belong. Identify it.
One of us.
Which one?
One of us.
How much did you say these things cost?
These NS5s haven't been configured yet. They're still just hardware. Basic 3 laws operating system. That's it. You don't know any better.
Now here's where it goes next level. In Genesis 3, enter in Nahash, the magician, the soothsayer, otherwise known as the serpent. And he's permitted to be there, and prompts the woman to shift her focus from the bounty of beautiful trees producing more food than they could ever eat, to this tree of discernment of function and dysfunction, and entices her to partake of it, so their quote-unquote eyes will be opened. Now they realize their nakedness, or base programming, if you will. It's like illicit code or malware or something. But the fallen angels, the Watchers, continue to bring illicit, malicious technology to humans, specifically designed to bring humans to ruin, to destruction. What's interesting, in the 3rd chapter, the standard translation reads that the tree was good to, quote-unquote, make one wise. What that word for wise means is to comprehend. Comprehension goes a step beyond superficial or surface level interpretation to a deeper level of understanding. So the tree didn't provide some knowledge set like a skill like agriculture. Adam already knew agriculture. He had already been keeping the garden. What the tree provided is comprehension, a higher cognitive function like intellect, and there is a distinction. In the mechanical translation, the tree of the discernment of function and dysfunction is, quote, craving to make calculations, end quote. At this point, they knew they were naked, but filled with knowledge they weren't equipped to manage yet. So God God goes into damage control, and the whole thing reveals a move of free will on the part of Nahash, the serpent, to introduce dysfunction, and a choice made by the humans, made in ignorance, made in error. Fast forward to Genesis 6 and enter in the Watchers and the Nephilim, and that word dysfunction shows up all over the place. In verse 2, the sons of God, the fallen ones, saw the daughters of men that they were functional and took for themselves wives and created offspring. Everywhere in Genesis where giants are mentioned comes with that word, dysfunction. Is there a moral element in there? Sure, because the result of dysfunction is not just error, but choosing to move away, to move in opposition from God, and act outside of God's design. In an attempt to seem cerebral and scientifically accurate, Garland throws out numerous theories, like de Broglie theory, also known as pilot wave, and the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, which states that human consciousness is the key modifier in decoherence, and the Copenhagen theory, which Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg contributed, all theories that are very problematic and assume this notion of superposition, that waves exist materially, quote-unquote, somewhere, but become decoherent for different reasons. While physics was my first love, I couldn't handle the math, so I got into psychology. But if you ask my very unqualified opinion, it is perfectly okay to accept the idea that particle waves can and do decay into oblivion. It's supported by the math and the science, real material science, with actual measurable and observable findings. A particle wave has no physicality. A probability is not a physical thing. It is nowhere until it is somewhere. But to take this position, this stance, you have to accept the notion of an omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, conscious observer. And no matter how you slice it, human consciousness cannot meet that description. There is nothing to support the material existence of anything that saw itself into being. The cosmos simply cannot see itself like the monad in Gnostic cosmology and bring itself into existence. But the Everett interpretation, literally the most absurd, laughable option on the table, is the one Garland goes with in the story, with a dash of de Broglie thrown in for good measure. And as these concepts do not present in the real world, not even a little bit, they seem to work perfectly inside a simulated reality. So let me break this down for you. Many worlds only works and can only exist and function in a computer simulation, which is probably why they're trying to make it a thing. The simulation is like a prison for which they can never ever escape, and it doesn't matter if it looks like utopia. You can see Garland placing all the players in these cubes, these boxes, all throughout the story. Like cages, like prisons. Just like the Gnostic concept of the demiurge. And you can see here what looks like an homage to Claude Bragdon's orthographic projection built into the walls of this wicked temple. Forrest goes on to hint at this notion of reincarnation, the many lives they must live. Take a listen.
We died.
We're in the system. Resurrection. As promised, remember?
We're in DEVS.
We're in DEVS.
In the simulation.
Paradise. In this variation, anyway. We are now living in many worlds. In this world, the two of us get to live in paradise with the ones we love. In other worlds, it will be closer to hell. For those other harder lives we have to lead.
And how did all this become possible?
What the did Lily do?
She made an actual choice. All her talk of God and messiahs. And look who she turned out to be.
What do you mean?
She committed the original sin. Disobedience.